Chapter 2. The Heavens as Medium, not Backdrop. It is one thing to propose that meaning may have existed prior to formal instruction. It is another to ask where such meaning could reside, in a way that is both accessible and enduring. The difficulty lies not in imagining that early humanity perceived patterns, but in identifying a medium capable of preserving these patterns without distortion. Speech fades, memory shifts, and even the most carefully transmitted oral traditions are subject to erosion. If meaning was to persist with any degree of consistency, it required a structure external to the human mind, something stable, visible, and resistant to alteration. The modern reader is inclined to overlook the most obvious candidate for such a role, not because it is implausible, but because it has been reclassified. The heavens, in contemporary understanding, are a field of physical objects governed by measurable laws. They are studied, catalogued, and explained in terms of mass, distance, and energy. This mode of analysis is precise and powerful, but it carries with it an implicit assumption that the heavens are fundamentally about what they are made of, rather than what they might signify. In reducing the sky to mechanism, modern thought has quietly removed it from the category of meaning. This was not always the case. For the ancient observer, the heavens were not an abstract expanse, but an immediate and unavoidable presence. They imposed themselves upon daily life with a consistency that few other phenomena could match. The rising and setting of the sun, the phases of the moon, the fixed arrangement of the stars, and the slow, deliberate movement of constellations across the seasons formed a pattern that was both reliable and public. It did not require specialized knowledge to notice it, it required only attention. More importantly, the pattern did not merely repeat, it progressed. The sky did not present the same arrangement at all times, but moved through a sequence that could be observed over the course of a year. This movement was not chaotic. It followed a path, a circuit, within which particular constellations appeared in a fixed order. The observer who watched long enough would begin to recognize not only individual forms, but their relationships to one another, their succession, and their reoccurrence. At this point, a distinction must be made. To recognize a pattern is not yet to assign it meaning. The mind can observe repetition without interpreting it. The question is not whether early humanity saw the same stars we see, but whether they approached those stars as potential carriers of significance. Here, the difference between backdrop and medium becomes decisive. A backdrop is passive. It exists behind events, providing context but not content. A medium, by contrast, is active in the sense that it conveys information. Writing is a medium because it encodes language in visible form. Music is a medium because it arranges sound into structured expression. In both cases, the material, ink, sound, serves as a vehicle for something beyond itself. To treat the heavens as a medium is to suggest that their arrangement and motion could function in a similar way, not as arbitrary decoration, but as structured form capable of being read. This does not require that the stars themselves possess intrinsic meaning in isolation. A single letter on a page carries little significance until it is placed in relation to others. Meaning emerges from arrangement, from sequence, from the relationship between parts. The heavens possess precisely these qualities. The stars are fixed relative to one another, forming identifiable groupings that persist over time. These groupings, what we call constellations, are not physically bound in the sense that they share a common location in space, but they are visually bound in the sense that they present consistent shapes to the observer. Once recognized, they can be recalled, anticipated, and compared. More significant still is the path along which these constellations are encountered. The sun appears to move through a specific band of the sky over the course of a year, passing through a series of constellations in a fixed order. This path, later formalized as the zodiac, is not an invention in the sense of being arbitrarily imposed. It is a recognition of a natural sequence. The observer does not create the order, he discovers it. The existence of such an ordered sequence invites a further question. If a set of distinct forms appears in a consistent progression, is it unreasonable to consider whether that progression might be interpreted as a narrative? Human cognition is, by its nature, attuned to sequence and story. We do not merely catalogue events, we connect them. We look for beginnings, developments, and conclusions. When presented with a structured series, the impulse to read it as a whole is not an aberration, but a fundamental aspect of how meaning is derived. This impulse can, of course, mislead. Patterns can be imagined where none exist, and significance can be projected into random arrangements. The possibility of error does not, however, negate the possibility of genuine structure. The task is not to abandon interpretation, but to discipline it, to distinguish between coherence that arises from the system itself and coherence that is imposed from outside. To that end, one must consider what would be required for the heavens to function as a meaningful medium. The system would need to exhibit internal consistency. Its elements would need to be distinct enough to be recognized, yet related enough to form a sequence. The order of that sequence would need to be stable, not subject to arbitrary rearrangement. Most importantly, the system would need to be accessible across generations, allowing the same patterns to be observed by different observers at different times. The heavens satisfy these conditions to a remarkable degree. Their patterns are not dependent on human preservation. They do not degrade with use. They do not require copying or replication. They simply persist. The same constellations that were visible to the earliest observers remain visible today, altered only in ways that occur over timescales far beyond the span of human history. If meaning were embedded in such a system, it would possess a durability that no purely human medium could match. It would be, in effect, a public text written on a scale that resists both decay and monopolization. No single group could alter it, no individual could erase it. It would be available to all, yet fully intelligible only to those who had learned how to read it. At this juncture, a common objection presents itself. To suggest that the heavens function as a medium of meaning is often taken to imply that they were intended for the purpose of guiding individual lives, predicting events, or exerting influence over human affairs. This association is understandable given the historical development of astrology, but it is not necessary to the argument being made here. A medium need not dictate outcomes in order to convey structure. A book does not control the reader's life simply by existing. It offers content, not compulsion. The distinction is critical. If the heavens are approached as a medium of representation rather than prediction, the question shifts. One is no longer asking what the stars will cause, but what they might signify. The focus moves from personal fate to collective meaning, from the individual to the universal. This is a different category of inquiry, and it must be evaluated on its own terms. To return, then, to the broader question of prior knowledge. If early humanity operated within a world that was not merely observed but read, then the presence of structured practices such as sacrifice become less opaque. The knowledge need not have originated solely in discrete acts of instruction. It could have been reinforced, clarified, and perhaps even initiated by patterns that were continually visible. The heavens, in this view, would not replace direct revelation or oral teaching, but would stand alongside them as a persistent frame, a reference point against which meaning could be measured and recalled. Such a possibility does not demand immediate acceptance. It does, however, warrant examination. The dismissal of the heavens as irrelevant to meaning is itself a relatively recent development, born of a shift in intellectual priorities rather than a definitive refutation of earlier perspectives. To consider that the sky might once have been read as more than a physical phenomenon is not a regress into superstition, but to question whether a dimension of interpretation has been prematurely closed. If the heavens were, or could have been, treated as a medium rather than a backdrop, then the structures within them deserve closer attention, not as isolated curiosities, but as parts of a sequence, not as objects, but as signs. The task that follows is therefore not to impose meaning upon the sky, but to examine whether a coherent pattern already exists, and if so, whether that pattern bears the marks of intentional arrangement or merely the appearance of it. The distinction will not be resolved by assertion. It will depend on whether the sequence, when examined as a whole, exhibits a degree of coherence that exceeds what chance alone would reasonably produce. It is to that sequence that we now turn.